Autocrats enjoy holding on to power. That's kind of what they do. Kim Jong-un, Vladimir Putin, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, well, he's trying anyway. And sometimes that longevity is a family affair. Just ask Raul Castro. Same's true for Kim. But what about Syria? After 5 million Syrian refugees and 500,000 dead Syrians, Bashar al-Assad has won his country's civil war. We don't talk about it very much here in the media. And the United States never really considered Syria a priority in the same way Russia, Turkey, or Iran had and do. But there's more to it than that. The Assads have real staying power. Remember, Papa Assad ruled his country for almost 30 years. And he may have passed on the burn-it-down approach to power that his son Bashar adopted. Hello and welcome to GZERO World. I'm Ian Bremmer. And today, I'll sit down with a man who's as plugged into the Assad family as they come and live to tell about it. He was the only journalist for a major Western newspaper permanently based in Damascus during those first years of Syrian civil war. I'm talking about Sam Dagger. Then, I've also got your puppet regime.
Hey, sup, guys? Sorry I'm late. Can I get in?
But first, a word from the folks who help us keep the lights on.
This is a family that's been in power for 50 years. The father had his coup in 1970, and then he bequeathed power to his son in 2000. So this is their motto, I would say. Either they stay in power or the country burns.
Where have you seen this plot before? A dominant boss with criminal ties hands over power to his reluctant and mild-mannered son, who then rules with an iron fist, eclipsing his father's brutality with a whole new scale of violence. I'll tell you where. That was The Godfather.
But if Clemenza can figure a way to have a weapon planted there for me, then I'll kill them both.
Bashar al-Assad is Syria's Michael Corleone. His eldest brother Basil is Sonny. Both were supposed to be the boss. Both died after driving in a car. Asaf, the brother-in-law, is Fredo. Both were rumored to have been killed by their brother, the new top capo, after being suspected of going against the family. And the father, Hafez, a man of the old school, was Vito. There's a long family history with the Assads that dates back to 1970 when Hafez first grabbed power. Born into an impoverished Sicilian, actually Alawite family, he resurrected the Ba'ath Party in Syria and built up its military with the help of the Soviets. When he died in 2000, his son Bashar, the British-trained ophthalmologist, you didn't see that in The Godfather, reluctantly took over. He was seen as a potential reformer right up until March 2011, when pro-democracy demonstrations were met with brutal government force. Fast forward to today. There are reports of Russian special forces and the Iranian Quds force fighting on the ground alongside government troops to help Assad finish the job. Syria's last opposition bastion of a bloody 8-year war is surrounded. And with U.S. forces largely withdrawn, Americans have all but checked out. Syria is not a U.S. priority after wars in Afghanistan and Iraq that are seen by most American citizens as failures. Nobody prioritizes the idea of Assad must go. That was, of course, Obama who promised that one. Under Trump, America First said no new wars would start. And while he was willing to engage in some pinpoint bombing to stop the Syrians from hitting their citizens with chemical weapons, after that, it was left to Assad. As a consequence, hard to see Syria as getting America's attention anytime soon.
The UN, for the most part, went along with that.
They've got big nominal ideas, but that's very different from execution capacity on the ground.
And that tells you, that speaks volumes.
I'm delighted to be here with Sam Dagger, writes for The Atlantic, and also a fairly meaty tome that just came out, Assad or We Burn the Country. You were there. You were even imprisoned for a while. This was not your title. This was someone else's title. When did you see this?
Well, this is the regime's slogan. I saw it on the walls of the opposition towns and neighborhoods that had been retaken by the regime with the help of Iran and Russia. So what would happen after they would reconquer these areas, the militias would go in, loot all the homes, then set them on fire, and then spray this graffiti on the walls, Assad or we burn the country. And I think it really distills the mentality of this regime over a 50-year period. So you have to keep in mind, this is a family that's been in power for 50 years. The father had his coup in 1970, and then he bequeathed power to his son in 2000. So this is their motto, I would say. This is their guiding principle. Either they stay in power, or either the country burns. And it's the way they deal with their own people, and the way they deal with the outside world as well.
And having spent a lot of time on the ground and experienced this revolution and war, what surprised you? What's a principal message that the media was not covering, that the average person watching the show doesn't actually understand?
A few people know this, that the father faced a similar challenge in the late 70s and early 80s. It wasn't only Islamist insurgents. I mean, when people think of that era, they immediately think of the Muslim Brotherhood and its armed wing that was challenging the regime. But there was actually, a secular protest movement against the regime. But like his son, 30 years later, he went after the peaceful protesters first. He wanted to get those people out of the picture and then say, I'm fighting a war on terrorism, exactly as his son did. For me, that was like the most revealing aspect of it.
And was it equally effective? Were the tactics similar?
Very similar, very similar. But obviously, the devastation under the sun was way, you could say 100 times more. With the father, it culminated in one massacre in Hama, a town called Hama, where estimates range anywhere from 7,000 to 10,000. But with the son, basically, you had a Hama in every neighborhood, in every town that rose up against the regime.
I remember when the power was transferred to Bashar, and no military background, eye doctor. Certainly the hope was that he would be more oriented towards the West. A question I would have is, how does the fact that he didn't have that military loyalty, that military command hadn't come through the ranks, how did that affect the brutality? How did it affect the autonomy of individuals? And also, where you got your information for the book, right, was one of his colleagues from the military.
Absolutely. His childhood friend from the Tlass family. So the Tlass and the Assads practically built this regime together. It was, the fathers, you had Hafiz al-Assad and Mustafa Tlass, they built this regime. But to go back about how Bashar, ended up where he did without having the military background, yes, obviously he didn't work for that power. The father did, and the father just handed it over to the son. But initially, the heir was the eldest son, called Basil al-Assad, and he was killed in a car crash in '94. So basically, and you see that in the book. I devote an entire chapter about the making of the heir, of the new heir, Bashar. So he's summoned from London, and he has to go through this grooming process. And the first order of business is to actually enroll in the military academy, even though he, as you said, he has zero background, zero inclination. And obviously, a lot of the regime insiders, the hardliners, were like, hold on a second. What are you doing? Why does it have to go to this son of yours? Maybe we understood the eldest son who had the military experience and the military aptitude. Yes, but this son, who was marginalized, who was on the fringe, in fact, he wanted to stay in London. He was studying to be licensed to actually work as an ophthalmologist in London, and suddenly he's summoned back, and he's prepared to be the heir. And yes, I mean, you have to remember the context of this period, the 90s, the Clinton administration. I mean, Bill Clinton thought that Hafez al-Assad would be through Syria and his, I would say, partnership, because that's how he kind of framed it at the time, that he would be able to have comprehensive Arab-Israeli peace. And obviously we all know the talks that were going on between the Israelis and the Syrians. So in that context, Hafez was sending the message to the Americans, chiefly like, let me take care of my own power. I will engage in peace talks, but don't interfere in what I'm doing domestically. And I think the Clinton administration went along with that. In fact, at the funeral of Hafez al-Assad, the dad, when he died in 2000, Madeleine Albright was there, and you see that there's a scene in the book, and she meets with Bashar al-Assad for 15 minutes, and then she comes out and declares to the media, I'm comforted by the fact that he's going to take the same path as his father. And the regime insiders, the people from the Tlass family, who are like the main character in the book, Manaf Tlass and his father, they breathed a sigh of relief. They said, well, this is U.S. benediction to the transfer of power to the son.
Yeah, and of course, that didn't go so well for them. When the uprisings start, on the one hand, this is coming on the back of all of these Arab Spring uprisings. On the other hand, as you say, the Syrians and Bashar Assad's father had been through this before. So how does the regime think about it? How do they respond? How is it different from what we saw in Egypt, for example, and the ouster of Mubarak?
Well, immediately they gave the shoot to kill orders. They wanted to scare people off the streets. And there's new information in my book that the shoot to kill orders were coming directly from Bashar al-Assad, from his brother Maher, who heads the 4th Division. This is like an elite division of the army, and also their cousin Hafez Makhlouf, he's an intelligence chief. So the orders were coming directly from these people saying, shoot and kill, because that's the only way to scare people off the streets.
Shoot to kill the unarmed civilian demonstrators.
Absolutely.
Which did indeed happen.
Absolutely.
And the demonstrations were kind of snuffed out in relatively short order.
Absolutely. I mean, every attempt by the protesters in Damascus, in other major cities like Homs, like Daraa, to actually occupy a square, because they were like looking to Egypt and saying to themselves, we want a Tahrir square, just like in Cairo, where we'd be able to protest. And every attempt by them was snuffed out with bullets and blood. There were a couple of attempts in Damascus. There was absolute carnage. I mean, they just opened fire on civilians who were just trying to occupy a square in Damascus. They did the same thing in Homs, and the orders were coming from the family. And then, if you remember, there was a period when they actually occupied a square in Hama, and that's the U.S. and the French ambassadors visited, and the protesters thought that maybe that would offer them some protection, but he ended up, assaulting the people who were in the square and killed a few hundred people, and then Obama came out and said he has to leave, at that moment.
Bashar Assad must go.
Must go, yeah.
Still there,
yeah.
Obviously. What was your experience there on we always hear the talk about the support that was given to the regime by the Russians, the support that was given to the regime by the Iranians. What was your experience of that? How did you see that when you were on the ground?
Well, when I was on the ground, it was mainly the Iranians, because I went in the fall of 2012. Yeah. If you remember, in the summer of 2012, the Americans and the Europeans were saying it's over. In fact, Hillary Clinton said the writing is on the wall. Now we have to figure out which country is going to take him. I mean, you'll see a scene in my book where they're debating in Geneva whether a Latin American or an African country will take Bashar. But obviously, That's where the Iranians entered into the picture. They took the lead in defeating this rebel offensive on Damascus in the summer of 2012, and then it culminated in the killing of Bashar's own brother-in-law. And I have evidence that the killing of the brother-in-law was ordered by Bashar because his loyalties became suspect, that maybe he was working out a deal with the West to be an alternative to Bashar.
I mean, when they decide that they're going to just go hard and immediately against their people, and it works, and they have clear support from the Iranians on the ground, they have clear diplomatic support and soon military support from the Russians. What do you think, I mean, if you were advising the Obama administration at that time, as someone who's been inside this country, what do you say we should do?
Back then?
Yeah.
I think the least we could have done is to have some sort of safe haven in the north. I think that would have been a sound idea. It would have perhaps given people
a no-fly zone.
A no-fly zone. I think that would have been doable. It would have stemmed this tide of the refugees that were going into Turkey. At least they would have had a safe zone in northern Syria. I think that was doable. But again, I think the thinking in the Obama administration at the time that this was a slippery slope towards an Iraq-like intervention.
Now, you've been on the ground in the Kurdish-controlled north since. Do they feel friendless? Do they feel forsaken by everyone? Do they feel like they have a shot at sort of stemming the Assad regime in any way?
I mean, again, when we talk about the Kurds, I think we have to be very careful because there were a fair number of Kurds that were actually with the uprising in the beginning, particularly when it was mainly peaceful. The Kurds you're referring to are the YPG, which are in effect an affiliate, an extension of the PKK in Turkey.
Yeah, and the Turkish government considers them to be terrorists.
Exactly, but we saw them as the most effective force in the fight against ISIS back in 2014.
And they continue to be nominally allied to the United States.
Yes, but for them, I mean, I was actually, I would say I was one of the first reporters to go into the area when the Americans started supporting them. If you remember, there was that offensive on Kobani in 2014, and they dropped weapons by air to them, weapons and ammunition.
And there were women fighting,
exactly,
and people showed that. Yeah, of course.
And I met with a lot of their leaders back then. This was like really, really the very, very early beginning of it. And they were quite frank with me. They said, look, we cut a deal with the regime, with Bashar al-Assad. In fact, they cut a deal with Bashar and Iran. You have to remember, Iran is like in the regime, so they're involved in every key decision that was made 2011 onward. So they cut a deal with Iran and Bashar to manage their own affairs in this oil-rich corner of northeast corner of Syria. And in exchange, they promised the regime to allow the flow of oil to the regime from that region. And also the regime kept the airport in that area. I mean, till this day, the regime is still at the airport, and also a security presence in one of the major cities there called Qamishli in northeast Syria. So that was the bargain, because Bashar, in fact, at the time was facing so many challenges on so many fronts. A number of cities were up in arms against him, so he wanted to focus on Damascus, defending Aleppo, the big cities. And he was saying, okay, I'll come back to this area later. So the Kurds took over, and they saw an opportunity basically to team up with the Americans because everybody was against them. It wasn't only it was the Turks, the rebels were against them, the opposition, because they saw them as puppets of the regime or stooges of the regime. And so everybody was against them. So they said, why don't we team up with the Americans to fight ISIS, in the hopes of this partnership eventually allowing us to have our own autonomous zone. And that's what they told me. They said, we're in it in the hopes that eventually we'll have our own cantons, they call them.
So we've been through this, extraordinary humanitarian collapse with half of the country fully displaced, with towns and cities, in some cases, destroyed. Now that Assad has reestablished control over almost all of the country, can you normalize? What's the process of rebuilding? And what's the process, can people move back that had been chased out by this regime?
People are moving back, but do they support the regime? No. The majority are just realists. They say he's being defended by the Russians and the Iranians militarily. The Americans and the Europeans, for all intents and purposes, want him there. Again, that's the perception on the part of the Syrians, that he's gassing people, he's committing massacres, he's targeting hospitals, as he and the Russians have been doing the past few weeks, and nobody's coming after him. He has some sort of, again, in the eyes of a lot of Syrians, he has immunity. So
tacit support.
Tacit support. So they say, what can we do? It's not up to us. So they've kind of reconciled themselves to the fact that there's nothing they could do. And for them, they see what Syrians who left the country had to go through, the indignity, the humiliation, particularly in the region, in countries like Lebanon, Jordan, and also in Europe.
And the danger.
And danger. Yeah. So they say, maybe we should just stay home. And yes, the regime is back. The regime is awful. It's worse than before. One resident of Damascus told me, the regime's military boot is on top of our heads again. There's nothing we can do. It's the same fear that we were living in under before. People are being arrested in a lot of the areas that are reverting back to regime control. Anyone who is suspected of having protested or taken part in any anti-regime activities being arrested again.
So no prospects of meaningful social instability going forward?
It's a fractured country and a fractured society at the moment. And I think the only hope we have is if we have meaningful justice and accountability, some sort of process of where people who've committed war crimes, mainly the regime and also others, pay for these crimes, are made to be held accountable for these crimes. I think that's the first step towards
any reason to believe that is remotely plausible?
At the moment, no. You see the Russians and the the Russians and the Chinese blocking any attempts in the Security Council to refer the regime to the International Criminal Court. There are these cases now being brought against the regime in Germany and France, but again, there's a limit how far these cases can go.
Sam Dagger.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And now for something completely different, I've got your puppet regime.
So, Mr. Kim, what's it like between you and the old Axis of Evil crowd these days?
Well, it's been different. Sup, guys? Sorry I'm late. Can I get in? Hey, what the...
Sup, Kim?
What?
I don't know. Why don't you tell us what? Yes, mister. I am best friends with Great Satan now.
What? Oh, no, you don't understand. It's...
You changed, man.
No, don't you see? It's like
Tell him how this movie will end. 2 years, Kim. I give it 2 years, and then one day, America will just walk out on you. Death to America!
What? No, Why can't you guys just be happy for me?
Axis of Evil isn't about being happy, Kim. It's about being evil. You're either with us or against us. He's right, man. You have to choose.
Well then, I choose...
That's our show this week. We'll be back next week, which is in exactly 7 days. So you can get ready. You can put it on your calendar. You can say GZERO World. Why would I miss that? Because that's why we're here. But in the meantime, if you like what you've seen, check us out on GZEROmedia.com.